We're recording, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It is April 9, 2026. This is a regular meeting of the Community Resources Committee of the Town Council. Um, let's see. I don't have my I don't have my anyway, welcome. Um, you can access this meeting by remote means if you go to the town website link. I don't have my text in front of me, so we're going to move on. Let's call the meeting to order. It is 1:02, and Counselor Walker, can you hear us?
Yes.
Mandy Johanicky,
Present.
um, Andy Churchill.
Yes.
Pam Rooney is present. We are waiting for Jennifer Taub, but we will get started. There are no public here, and there's Nate. There are no public hearings today, so we're going to move to item 3, which is general public comment. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to speak, please raise your hand. I see one hand raised. This would be public comments on matters within the jurisdiction of the CRC. You're welcome to express your thoughts for up to 3 minutes, and we will not be holding a dialogue on any matter raised during public comment. So when I call on you, please state your full name and where you live. I have Jamal McQuid raising a hand. Jamal, come on in. Jamal, can you unmute? Hi, Jamal. Can you hear us? Athena, is there some way to help?
They put their hand down, so maybe let's move on to Renata and come back.
Okay, all right, let's go to Renata. Hi, Renata. You can unmute yourself and welcome.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Hi. Because we're discussing solar, the energy bylaw, is there any consideration into plug-in panels? I've been hearing a lot about that, and it works really well in Germany, and there are companies doing this in the US. Some of them are trying to get UL certified, and I just want to make sure that there's no barriers for us to have that in our houses. Because Amherst put barriers on everything. So I just want to make sure that you don't. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll explore that. Get back to you on that. Is Jamal able to attend? Jamal has disappeared. I would like to make a comment that following the presentation, I would be willing to open up the floor for public comment for a short period after the presentation by Flinker, if no one has an objection to that. So we'll move on to action items, and we are very happy to welcome Peter Flinker and Dylan Sussman from Flinker Associates. And we've got Nate Malloy to introduce them, I think. Go ahead. And we're looking at, 45 minutes to an hour of presentation if that's needed, with some time for questions from the committee and or the public.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. Hi, everyone. Nate Malloy, a planner with the town. Yeah, Dotson and Flinker will give a presentation of the downtown design standards. And then, we can have public comment and questions. I would encourage committee members and the public listening. There's a web page in the planning department, and there's an online form to use. And it does ask specifically, what areas of the standards you have questions on or comments. And we want people to use those forms because, then it's in the same structure and it's easier for the consultants. We'll still accept emails, but if you can put them in the forms, that's great. The standards have been, almost 2 years in the making. So although this is kind of the first public viewing with the CRC, Dotson and Flinker has been working with, a working group in the town for a while. There was an open house last month. They presented to the planning board. They will be presenting to the Commissions for Persons with Disabilities next week and the Historical Commission. And then there'll be, synthesis of all the comments received, and then perhaps an updated draft in a few months, and then, another round of public comment and input. So, this is kind of the first chance for the CRC. And as I told the planning board, the idea would be that this could be on the agenda after the consultants are here for the CRC to talk about it. There's a lot of information, right? There's a lot of material there. And so, feel free to discuss it without them, and staff can be here to help. And also, to relay any comments or concerns. So the planning board did that last night, for 45 minutes and has some questions and comments. And so that'll be relayed to Peter and Dylan. So I can turn it over to them. If there's any general questions about the process or anything, I could pause now for that.
Sure. Anyone have comments or questions? I don't see anybody raising their hand. Let's go.
All right. So I think Peter's going to start off the presentation, but before we did that, I just wanted to check if we've done the presentation a few times. I know I saw some of you at the open house kickoff meeting. How many of you have seen a previous version of this presentation? So Pam and Andy. Okay.
We do have people in the public in the audience, though, who may not have seen it and would appreciate understanding the full depth of it.
All right, so we'll go through the full thing. I'm going to share my screen if that is an option. It looks like it is.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Finally being able to present the final draft of some of these ideas for your consideration. We're going to do a quick overview of sort of the process that we went through, and then present the three different elements of the design standards. As you probably know, there's currently design review standards from some decades ago that support the work of the Design Review Board jurisdiction, and that outline in blue is sort of the core of the area that we're working with, but it was expanded to sort of include some of the logical adjoining blocks. Next slide, please. Among the things we did was look at the implications of the current zoning for sort of future development. We sort of carefully mapped out how much you could build on each lot and what it might look like. Next slide. We also did measured cross sections and other sort of inventory work on the main street, because part of this project was to look at both the sort of what we call the private realm of the private lots adjacent to North Pleasant Street, the other streets, and then also the public realm with a focus on updating the streetscape design standards. So part of that was looking carefully is exactly how are the streets and sidewalks and planters and ramps and so on working now in different areas. And what we discovered, spoiler alert, is that there's a lot of diversity. And so part of the final recommendations is to simplify and sort of unify the standards throughout the downtown. Next slide. We also did a fair amount of public outreach, including sort of field outreach at the farmers market, where we heard from individuals about their vision for downtown Amherst. We also had some public workshops. We're starting with a site walk on a beautiful late summer day, walking up and down different groups, talking about what works and what doesn't work in the downtown. We always find it's really good to start with sort of listening to people's concerns about the place where they live and work. And that continued with an evening workshop, sort of focusing on, again, what works and what doesn't work, what needs to be preserved and what needs perhaps to be changed. And that was followed on the next day by a visioning workshop, where, as some of you recall, we brought a big model of sort of the core areas of the downtown and let people manipulate buildings to sort of experiment with what would happen if you fill in some of the gaps along the street, some of the parking lots with new buildings that could bring more sort of continuous activity to the street. And then what would be the implications for parking? Where would you put the parking? How would you get around downtown? We found that was really helpful as we move forward. Next slide. We did a what's so-called visual preference survey, which is basically asking people to look at photographs and comment on whether they thought this was a good fit for downtown Amherst or not. So we had 377 responses to the survey about building design and 252 responses for design of streetscapes. Some of the results, predictably, perhaps people really responded most favorably to fairly traditional building styles, including some of the historic buildings shown at the upper left there. For contemporary buildings, they preferred those perhaps that are still reflect sort of the shape and scale of traditional buildings. And the ones which they liked least, going down to the lower right there, are ones which are, a little bit more, I guess, regimented and contemporary. And so based on this, we try to distill, what are some of the principles behind what people like and don't like in the downtown. The next slide. This is a visual preference survey of sort of outdoor design and along the streetscape. And again, I think what we concluded is that people like active, lively streets where there's a lot to see and do, but which are well organized, where you can walk easily through this environment, but there's clearly places to sit, good access to buildings, and as I said, a lot to see and do and enjoy there, and a lot of shade as well. As you know, we've been meeting over the course of almost 2 years with an ad hoc committee or working group that included representatives from lots of different institutions and representatives of different constituencies within the town, from residents to developers, from Amherst College and the university. And we had really great discussions, I thought, over the course of that time. And I think it bore out the idea behind it, which is to have a place where you could talk openly and objectively about issues before you have to make decisions, which I think resulted in what we hope is kind of a balanced plan for growth and continued success in downtown Amherst. We, based on all of this feedback, we sort of diagrammed out sort of the simple principles of what we heard, some of the strengths of the downtown, the historic buildings around the common itself and the other parks, Kendrick Park and Sweetser Park, the fact that it's very walkable now with a lot of interesting things to look at, and including the town buildings sort of at the core of North Pleasant Street corridor, and the nice streetscapes, places where people like to sit, a lot of nighttime activity, and the fact that there's a lot of people who live and work in the downtown and around it, which really adds to the vibrancy. Next one. Some of the weaknesses, as you can imagine, sort of empty spaces that are filled with cars in many cases. I mean, people realize they need parking, they want to have parking nearby, but nobody wants to look at it. Some people focus that the North Pleasant Street corridor is kind of chaotic, particularly if you're on a bicycle. It's a lot of traffic, it's not very wide, and there's a lot going on. And there are challenging intersections, especially for people walking and biking. People pointed out the lack of a grocery store, the lack of sort of consistency in the streetscape, perhaps too many curb cuts, awkward and unused terraces in front of businesses, and inconsistency between the newer and the older buildings. And the fact that Some areas are too dark, and the adjacent neighborhoods are not necessarily well connected. Next slide. Some of the opportunities are really focused on taking some of those empty parking lot spaces and some of the less historic buildings and finding opportunities to create more places for people to live and work, to improve the functionality of the parking and to have better outdoor spaces. And then along North Pleasant Street to create more room for pedestrians and bicyclists. That said, our recommendations really focus on the design of the sidewalk space between the curb and the buildings. We did not address the design of the street itself, so we're not going to talk about on-street parking or bike lanes, and we didn't have any real recommendations for that as part of our concluding report.
Just to jump in here, and the reason for that is because when you get into designing the street, it's a more complicated engineering process that was basically just beyond the scope of the project. So if you want to talk about bike lanes, especially bike lanes that might be grade separated at the level of a sidewalk or something like that, you might get into moving curbs and drainage, and it quickly becomes a very complicated process. So we focused on the space between the existing curbs and the front of the buildings for the public realm design.
Right. And then a lot of focus of the project was on sort of what's the existing and future character of downtown Amherst. The current guidelines and the zoning as well, really, one of the things it says is, well, when you're building a new building, make it fit into the context of what's around it. And then what we discovered is that there are many contexts in terms of design in downtown Amherst, from the historic center around the Common to contemporary buildings, the North End, and pretty much everything you can imagine in between. So this, next slide, please. This sort of led to some diagrams really showing how that works, where we have sort of a solid traditional area in the lower left there around the Common. We have in the north a very sort of modern block between East Pleasant Street and Triangle Street. We have sort of cozy residential block on the west side of Kendrick Park. And in between, there's sort of a mix of a very funky, sort of mixed retail commercial area, and then something which we call the Hinge, which is kind of the space where the churches and the post office really create literally a hinge between the historic downtown and the northern end of the downtown. And then this sort of became the basis of how we're shaping the guidelines. So it was sort of carried forth into what we're calling character zones. Again, the sort of lower left, the downtown traditional Main Street area, which is sort of the historic core surrounding the Common. What we're calling the downtown village, which is in purple, which is kind of a transitional scale in between the larger buildings in the core and the more residential blocks around it. And then what we call the downtown modern Main Street, which is the block again between North Pleasant Street and Triangle Street, which has the newer contemporary buildings, but really has been in transition since after World War II properly. It was a lot of sort of automobile related uses ever since that time, and now is becoming something else again. And then finally, what we call the downtown neighborhood, which is in the green, which are these little less dense blocks west of Kendrick Park and on some of the outskirts of the other blocks, where you have a mix of uses, but generally more green space. And part of that is because there's some wetlands in the back. There's also large, deep lots where the front of the lot is developed and the back of the lot is vacant. Next slide, please. So we developed the design standards in 3 volumes. The first one is sort of the overall context and vision. The second is the design standards for the private development. And the third is design standards for the public realm. And we wanted to start with the vision because what we find frequently doing design standards, if you don't know what you want, even if you have very specific design standards for individual elements like the design of a building or tree plantings or so on, it's very hard for people to review development effectively. And we find that having a clear vision that's stated really develops the principles behind the design standards and gives you a touchstone. So when someone comes forward with a building and you say, no, we really want to have a wide sidewalk in front of this building, and they say, all right, I don't want to do that, you can refer to the vision as well as the standards themselves. So it's not just we want a 10-foot sidewalk, but it's we want a 10-foot sidewalk because we're trying to achieve this vision for our downtown. And so we'll talk about how that's set up within these 3 volumes. The first is includes the sort of existing conditions analysis and then a vision for each of the sub areas within the downtown. And this can be used to guide applicants during the design process. And it can also be used by boards during discretionary reviews, especially the design review board, whose standards are really largely about fitting into the context. So that, again, the vision describes what that context is meant to be in the future. And it potentially could be adopted as the rules and regulations of the planning board, the ZBA, and the design review board. Next is volume 2, which is the design standards for the sort of private lots. And this includes zoning dimensions and use standards, building design standards, sign and lighting standards. And it's really, again, meant to provide sort of more objective information that can guide applicants during their design process and then be used by the planning board and ZBA during the site plan and special permit review, as well as by the design review board. It potentially can be adopted. Some parts of it will need to be adopted into the zoning to sort of bring the zoning in alignment with the vision. Others could be adopted into zoning or the rules and regulations of the planning board and the ZBA and could be adopted by the design review board. So the first volume is basically here's where we're trying to go. The second volume is meant to be more of a checklist of specific standards for different elements that people can say, have you done this? Yes or no. Then the third volume is really focused on the public realm. Again, as Dylan said, the design of the space between the front of the buildings and the curb, including the sidewalks and street trees and furnishings and so on. Probably going to be used most directly by the DPW when making improvements downtown, but also can be applied to development projects when they're going to be digging up that space between the building and the curb. Potentially could be adopted by the DPW and or by the town council. So I'm going to talk about the first volume, and then Dylan will review volumes 2 and 3. So this volume starts with a history of the downtown in terms of sort of design context, because a lot of that is sort of based on the very historic 19th century, primarily downtown design. On the lower right, you see an image that talks about when buildings were constructed. And you can see around the Common, it was pretty consistently in the 1830s to the 1890s, 1915. And then as you go north, there are newer buildings, again, post-war buildings in orange between 1946 and 1968, including that block, much of the block east of Kendrick Park. And then the newest buildings in yellow, which includes some of the new apartments on that block, as well as, the Bank Center and some of the buildings around the outskirts of the downtown. Next slide. So we looked at the sort of pattern of development in the private realm, which included sort of looking at existing massing and fenestration, how buildings are designed currently in the downtown and what elements they share, like windows being lined up in rows and columns that sort of thing. We looked at the way that buildings enclose the space along the street. You know, what are the setbacks? How tall are the buildings? And what does that result in terms of the experience of the street? Next slide. We took, based on all the discussion at the workshops and with the working group, won't read all the fine print here, but basically developed a written vision, again, as sort of overall guidance for where we want to go with the downtown. Includes elements of being community oriented, welcoming, accessible, comfortable, livable, prosperous, and resilient. And a lot of good information there when you have time. Next slide. This is the existing zoning map. As I said, part of this is thinking about how zoning is going to have to change. But currently there's sort of 3 existing zones, which I think we're very conscious that there was a lot of discussion that went into the current zoning. But big picture is sort of a core mixed-use district along North Pleasant Street, and then districts with somewhat less density surrounding that to create a transition between the activity along the North Pleasant Street and the surrounding neighborhoods. And that was a theme that continued throughout all of our discussions with the working group and the public, and is part of our recommendations to sort of continue that pattern. Next slide. This is the existing overlaid with some of the proposed changes. So from basically the general business zone, we're proposing to divide it into 2 areas. One is sort of the traditional core to the south, and then this modern sort of Main Street to the north, and that block between North Pleasant Street and Triangle Street. And then to modify the pattern a little bit, changing some of those interior blocks from the BL to what we're calling the downtown village, and then changing the RG a little bit, which we'll show in some subsequent slides. But first, I want to talk about the sort of vision for each of the sort of downtown sub-districts. The first one is the traditional Main Street district, and the intent there is really continue more of what works very well in that: buildings close to the sidewalk, a wide, comfortable sidewalk with places to sit, places to eat outdoors, trees and attractive street furnishings, and a lot of transparency on the ground floor. The next slide. One of the things we did was explore potential redevelopment of some of the blocks in each of these zones. So this is on the upper left there is the main corner of Main Street, North Pleasant Street, and Amity Street, with the key building, the Bank of America, as it is now in the upper right. And then the lower right, sort of potential redevelopment under the recommended vision. So the idea is basically to continue the pattern of the existing 19th century buildings around that corner to really create a more substantial and I won't claim that it's more attractive, but something that really fits the context, I think, a little bit better. And part of that is just doing some simple things which are elucidated in the design standards, like lining up buildings or lining up windows and doors in regular rows and columns to have, again, an open, transparent ground floor that would be good for business and add life and interest to the pedestrian experience. And then to do some simple things like stepping back the top floor a little bit to prevent the kind of looming facade that you sometimes can get when a building is right on the sidewalk with 5 stories. And one thing to keep in mind is that currently, under the current zoning, you can build a 5-story building right on the sidewalk with no setbacks and no step backs in the upper part. So this is, again, sort of recommending some simple changes which we think can help new buildings fit a little bit better into the current historic pattern of the downtown. One of the things to keep in mind too is that these are just imaginary scenarios. They're meant to demonstrate the principles and the ideas in the vision and the design standards, but they're certainly not required for any landowner, including the Bank of America, to build this building. They will have to comply with the zoning, but the design and whether or not they decide to ever change that building is entirely up to the individual owners. Next slide. So each of these sort of sections has what we call precedent imagery, including, in that case, the Amherst House, which used to sit on that corner, a very interesting 4.5-story building. And then we have precedents from other places, like on the lower left, a building that's fairly contemporary in its design, but reflects a lot of the historic patterns with materials and windows and doors and transparency that basically, would be recognizable to someone 150 years ago. And then on the right, some examples of shady, attractive, walkable streetscapes sort of show where we're trying to go with all of downtown Amherst. Next slide. This is, again, the other end of North Pleasant Street between Kendrick Park and Triangle Street. It's this area we're calling Modern Main. And here, the overall massing is basically the same, 4- and 5-story buildings. But sort of recognizing that this area has been in transition for a long time, it already has got some very interesting contemporary architecture, is to sort of continue that pattern, but do it in a way that's perhaps less blocky, that has a little bit wider sidewalks, a little bit more setback from the buildings, and buildings that step back on the upper story again to create a little bit more sort of light and space along the streetscape, and sort of that combined with, as you see here, a lot of interesting streetscape materials, places for dining, places to sit, and a lot of trees to really make something that, again, complements the traditional character around the common, but also is, can be very contemporary and interesting in its own way. Next slide.
Oops.
Right. So then in between is something we're calling the Downtown Village. And that's sort of represented by the lower left there, which is the corner of Cowles Lane and North Pleasant Street. So it's sort of replacing, 1- and 2-story buildings with something that might be 3.5 or 4 stories, but doing it in a way that reflects more of the, what we call the scale and proportions and character of the surrounding residential blocks. So basically, there's been a lot of interesting experimentation with this in recent years, but it's basically taking, residentially scaled components, like a 3.5-story building with, as you see in that image at the lower left, but then combining those together into a larger structure. And then some of the precedents include examples which really show what the intent is, which is to combine the buildings and the open space to continue the kind of interesting experience that is in that area right now. A lot of people really love sitting in that sort of sunny side of the street, enjoying a cup of coffee. There's a lot of greenery. And so the idea is to, allow the buildings to be a little bit bigger, if not, and hopefully better, but also maintain a lot of that greenery and outdoor space. So the next slide shows, again, 2 different alternatives for that block between Coles Lane and Halleck Street. And sort of one of the ideas is to have somewhat smaller, more complex buildings along North Pleasant Street to continue the existing pattern of buildings. But maybe because you have some room behind that, you could have a larger building with an interior garage, as shown in the lower left. You could have townhouses or somewhat larger apartment buildings on the upper right. But the idea is to show that, across this range of building types and changes in density, there are some things we want to hold on to, which is buildings that have, again, the massing and the roof lines that reflect more of the residential context, and a lot of attention to outdoor space to sort of continue that wonderful, interior spaces that are found in a lot of the blocks in the downtown, where you can sort of go in between buildings and discover, interior spaces, places to sit, because that's part of what makes the downtown interesting and lively. Next slide. And then this, I think, is the final area, which we're calling the downtown neighborhood, is shown in green on the upper left there. Biggest block is the one west and north of Kendrick Park, and then some of the outlining areas to the south of that. But again, here it's kind of the same idea, a little bit smaller scale. Try to have, encourage new development and allow a sort of modest increase in density, but in a way that really reflects, again, what's going on in the surrounding residential neighborhoods. So on the upper right, that's the simulation showing sort of in the back of the existing structures, a new row of buildings. Again, in some of those deep lots, there's a lot of room for buildings which could be lined up along the open space with parking in between. And part of the idea that we're promoting is, instead of everyone having their own driveway and their own parking lot, you connect the parking lots together with interior driveways that cross the lot lines. And that allows you to close off some of the curb cuts, the driveways that are coming out on North Pleasant Street, and replace those with attractive buildings and places for people to sit and greenery. So again, it's sort of trying to maintain the best parts of that neighborhood, but also allow some growth that's going to, allow for housing that people need, but also encourage people to replace some of the buildings that should be replaced over time. And some of the imagery for that is sort of a simulation on the upper left. Again, the idea is to use kind of a residential scale for buildings which, they may be larger than a single house would be, but they look like several houses that have been connected together and have a lot of the elements that people like yard spaces to sit, porches, and so on, and great pedestrian connections. And then some of the precedent imagery includes infill development of this type, which we know works very well. We've seen a lot of examples of how it can allow, again, sort of modest increase in density and new homes, but still feel like a pretty quiet residential neighborhood.
All right, I'm going to take over from Peter. I'm Dylan Sussman. I work with Peter Flinker at Dodson and Flinker. And I'm going to talk about the second two volumes. I'll try to move through them quickly so that we have plenty of time for you guys to ask questions and share your thoughts. So, as Peter said, the first volume is about the existing conditions and the vision. It's primarily would be used to sort of guide applicants when they're preparing designs for projects, and then by the design review board with their sort of mandatory advice process. The second volume is focused on objective standards for private development. So this is more closely aligned with zoning. And in fact, we found that zoning in Amherst, as in most places, is one of the sort of primary controls on design. So zoning is a design cookbook. Whether you like the results of it or not, it sets the basic parameters for development, how buildings sit on lots, their basic height and massing. And so there are some changes that we're recommending to the basic zoning because we think they're necessary to get better results for downtown Amherst. So in the second volume, slicing and dicing things further, there are 4 different parts to the second volume. And that basically are designed to be implemented in different ways, and also with a little bit of a sense of, you know, what might be the highest priority, and then secondary priorities. So the first part is making those zoning changes that zoning map changes that Peter talked about a little bit before. There's a proposed zoning map in this volume that makes changes to the zone and also adds some features to the zoning map that go beyond what's on there now. So regulating where there should be ground floor commercial required to be occupied, basically. And then in other areas where it would be acceptable to build spaces that can be occupied by commercial, but not necessarily requiring them to be occupied at this time. So it's a change from the way ground floor commercial is currently regulated in your zoning. And then establishing areas on the edges of the zoning district where they're butting up against existing residential areas that would be outside of this downtown. And that would apply basically sort of transitional regulations about height to provide some relief for adjacent properties. So these zoning district changes, the map changes, are necessary because we think it's important to separate out the traditional Main Street around the Common and on North Pleasant Street from that modern Main Street area, because we think it's important to establish different dimensional standards there. Basically, we want to keep the kind of street wall or the buildings lined up along the street around the Common, but have slightly larger setbacks, front setbacks in the modern Main area, where you don't have a kind of established pattern quite yet. And you could provide some more breathing room for wider sidewalks and more public spaces along the street. And then in the areas that are BL and RG, the idea is to separate those out from other areas of the town, so you can have customized standards for those. That's why we're proposing zoning map changes. Part of this includes sort of sidewalk width classes, so I can talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm just going to show some examples of what this looks like. We encourage you to look at it, read through it, and as Nate said, submit some comments to the town website using the form that's available there. Or if you have a lot of comments, there's an Excel sheet you can download and make comments through that. It is really, really useful for us to get comments that are specific to a page, specific text, and specific recommended changes. And that we get that in an organized fashion so that we can compare different comments from different people. So an example of a change that's recommended, would require a change to the zoning that exists. Yeah, it's, to change the front setbacks, adding a little bit of a front setback in the traditional Main Street, a little bit more in the modern Main Street area, and a bit more than that in the downtown neighborhood. And establishing maximum front setbacks in all of those areas, with the idea that you want buildings to be within a range, close to the sidewalk, but not too close and not too far as well. There's a recommended change to building height, increasing the building height a little bit in the areas that are currently the BG district, basically to align with the way that buildings are currently built. And to reduce the need for waivers from the planning board. And then increasing the height in the downtown village to allow, again, buildings that seem like they would be basically more economically viable. So there's in every community, there's a sort of an economic formula of how much people paid for properties, and then how much development they need to get out of it to make it worthwhile for them to make changes to those properties. So if the goal for downtown Amherst is to have more commercial spaces and or higher quality commercial spaces, or more housing, or more tax revenue, or more places for people to live so that they can either, so they have a place to live, and as well so they can support businesses by being within walking distance, then if you want any of those changes, you need to make it economically viable for property owners to do that. And so the changes to height and some of the other ones I'm going to talk about are intended to do that. So part of this is about improving the design of new construction, and part of it's about improving the design in areas where there are existing buildings that could be replaced by better ones. But in order to do that, you need change. In order to have change, you need it to be viable. All right, so moving on, other necessary or other recommended zoning changes that are in this volume are about uses, changes to allowed uses, primarily switching things from special permit to site plan review. What we've heard from developers in Amherst and in every other community we work in is that predictability is very, very important. So a developer needs to know that if they're going to invest in very costly engineering and architectural plans to produce a permit application, that's going to result in a project that they can actually implement. And it goes beyond that. It also ties into the availability of financing. So a developer often needs to be able to line up their financing, and lenders are sometimes not willing to lend to projects that require a discretionary permit. Other necessary zoning changes, we're recommending a change to the mixed use requirements, basically changing how the formula for that works so that it's based on a percentage within a certain depth of the sidewalk, really focusing on the area where ground floor commercial is most important, which is that area where you can see into a store, where it's bringing street life, bringing people to the street and making the place look interesting. It's the highest value sort of commercial space on a main street. And those changes are in line with what was recently adopted for the University Drive area. And then changes to required lot area, additional lot area per family, which is a sort of key limiting factor in the RG, in the BL currently. Changes to frontage and lot coverage and building coverage and setbacks and parking requirements. All of those are based on those drawings that Peter showed earlier. So our approach to this kind of project is to look at specific sites, to draw plans showing what we think are kind of ideal build outs of specific locations, recognizing that what somebody proposes for those are not going to be exactly what we show because they have their own program and they have their own needs. But we do those drawings so we can then abstract out the zoning standards, right? So we can look at our own drawing and measure how much lot area, how much lot coverage is necessary there. What are the setbacks that we're showing? And so that when people like yourselves look at the zoning, you can look at the vision, you can look at the plan drawings and see whether it looks like something you want, and know that those dimensional standards are based on a vision. They're not pulled out of thin air. All right, the new design standards cover many aspects of building design based on feedback we heard from the public, and also looking very closely at the existing conditions and trying to figure out what it is that's making those buildings that people like in downtown Amherst. What are the key characteristics of them, so that the planning board or the design review board has objective standards by which to review projects. And so they can say, yes, this meets the standards, or no, this doesn't meet the standards. And everybody can know what is expected from the beginning, which includes the applicants as well as, residents of Amherst and abutters. So this is a general approach, is trying to make things as objective as possible, as predictable as possible. Some examples of that, there's a standard for the maximum length of a building side. Then within that, if a building is over a certain length, then the facade is required to either step forward or step back. So there's variation along the street. And then within that, breaking up the facade into sort of recognizable bays, which is a very common characteristic of those kind of 19th century buildings along the North Common in Amherst. There's standards for storefront design, customized to the different areas of the downtown. And then standards for things like how to deal with grade changes along the front of a property, retaining walls, new curb cuts, surface parking, landscaping and plant types, etc. In addition, there are some guidelines for lighting and signage, which are topics that are covered by your zoning already. And so in this case, these are not objective standards, they're guidelines to try to get clearer about what's intended. The third volume is about the public realm. So these would, as Peter said earlier, would be used by the DPW to try and standardize things. A lot of them are based on the current practices of the DPW, but writing them down so that they continue to be implemented consistently. And then there are other topics that the DPW doesn't have a consistent current practice. And so this establishes requirements for those. So what we noticed in the downtown is that it's pretty diverse, and that's the result of kind of incremental testing and experimentation by your DPW, responding to what they hear from the public, from what I understand, and also responding to what they see about how different designs work over time. So how concrete ages, how different scoring patterns crack, how concrete spalls, etc. So the design standards try and deal with those different challenges of inconsistency, elevation changes, competing uses, etc. They cover most aspects of the space between the sidewalk and the front of the building, pretty much everything we can think of. As I said before, there are these different sidewalk width areas that are called out. Our general approach to this is that we heard that Amherst probably is not going to do a wholesale redesign and rebuild of downtown anytime soon. And so change to the streetscape will be incremental through the combination of town projects, small town projects over time, as well as any improvements associated with the redevelopment. So we're working kind of within the existing framework of the curbs and working within the idea of it being incremental change. So we looked at the space between the curb and the front of the building throughout the downtown and came up with basically that there's sort of 3 different types of widths in the downtown. A large sidewalk of 15 feet or greater, a medium sidewalk of 10 feet and 10 to 15 feet, and a small sidewalk of less than 10 feet. And so based on that, we set requirements for the parts of the sidewalk. So the part you walk on, which we call the throughway, the space between where you walk and the curb, which is the furnishing utility zone, which is the location where trees are planted, benches go, bike racks typically go, trash cans go in that area. And then a few extra areas that are sometimes there and sometimes not. And each of these has a minimum width. And it also has standards for materials and construction of those areas. So examples of what the medium and the small sidewalks look like. You can see that the constituent parts get smaller, but that in the medium and the large sidewalks, the basic palette of materials remains the same, having a concrete throughway with regular scoring, and then unit pavers, concrete unit pavers in the furnishing utility zone. And we had a lot of discussions, we had a dedicated workshop about streetscape. We got feedback from the survey, etc. We had a lot of conversations about what these materials should be. And generally, what we heard is they want a concrete place to walk, and they want some distinction for the area for sitting. And that the proposal here continues those concrete unit pavers, which you have in some places in downtown. So trying to manage that transition over time, as I said, because it's going to happen incrementally. As I said before, there's specifications, for the materials and construction for those. There's a section that deals with elevation changes, standards for things like parklets, which are temporary uses of parking spaces for on-street dining. A lot of attention paid to street trees and how to plant trees so that they survive to maturity. And I'm gonna stop there. There are a lot of other standards in all of in volumes 2 and 3 that I didn't cover. So again, encourage you to look at those and think about what they would mean for the future and give us feedback.
Thank you very much. That was, every time I listen to your presentation, I pick up some additional information, so I appreciate it.
The chain is
I need
probably every time. Hopefully we don't
I
contradict ourselves from one to the next.
I need to note that Jennifer Taub joined us at 1:10, so that's for the record. While we have Peter Flinker and Dylan Sussman with us and Nate, are there any questions from any of the CRC members? Mandy.
Yeah, so I want to thank Dylan and Peter for coming and giving that. I started delving into this yesterday, and I will be filling out the Excel sheet. But as the presentation went forward, I had a couple of sort of overarching questions that sort of stood out to me. And I'm hoping you can give me your thoughts on those questions. The first one is, if this is really design guidelines, design standards, we're putting them into the zoning, is it logical? Is it necessary? Is a design review board actually still needed at that point if we adopt all of this into our zoning? You know, a lot of what I've read about creating more housing opportunities and all and making it less cumbersome to buy is every review you need to do adds costs, and if you're trying to make things more affordable, you kind of don't want to add more reviews. And so if you've already put all the design standards into the zoning code, do you actually need a design review board when another board is already looking at that design? So that's one of my first questions. And I just have 4 of these sort of. The second one is, it looks like some of the area of the BL, although now that I'm looking at it, I think it's one property only, is going into downtown neighborhood instead of downtown village. And I'm curious why you decided to remove that property sort of from, I think, what is sort of your intention to be an equivalent BL type neighborhood. It's north of Cowles Street, I think, just the one property north of that. Seems like that's a little bit of a down zoning. And in your description of downtown neighborhoods, similarly, seemed like the goal was small scale multi-unit development. Yet I noticed in the design in book 2 that you were still allowing single family homes in that neighborhood. So could you speak to why you wouldn't say no to single family homes in that neighborhood if the goal is small scale multifamily? And finally, is this intended to be the zoning, or is this intended sort of more as an overlay such that the underlying zoning could also be, a developer could choose to be built under? Those are my 4 for now. Thank you.
What? Go, Nate, and then maybe give them a chance to respond.
Sure, thanks. Those are good questions, Mandy. In terms of the design review board, you know, staff's also kind of had similar questions, but we haven't reached a conclusion. So it could be that, you know, they're empowered more through these standards and they can apply them in a similar role. Maybe they actually become more regulatory, you know, or not. And so we haven't really made that decision. I think it's something that is part of the conversation. I mean, really it is then, you know, how do we apply and implement the standards? And so it kind of gets to your last question. You know, we've talked about this. Is it form-based code or is it zoning? I actually don't think it can work as an overlay. I think we actually have to change the base zoning. And it's a combination, it's like a hybrid of, say, traditional zoning and form-based zoning. So I think if you like what you see in some of the renderings, what we have now doesn't get you there. And so I think it has to be, you know, kind of a careful assessment of where in the zoning it would change. And so, you know, an overlay, an overlay is nice because you can say it applies to this, maybe this one use, and you have a kind of a simple thing that you can kind of narrow in on with an overlay. I think this is too broad. There's too many factors. And so, in terms of the use, they're recommending use changes, dimensional changes, architectural standard changes. And so I think it'd be really complicated to have an overlay and then, this being an overlay, but someone could still do a mixed use building not in the overlay. So but again, that hasn't really been decided. I think, what they've illustrated is that to achieve what they're showing needs zoning changes. I think we still have to get to the point like, do we agree with some of the recommendations and what are the right steps to get them to be, achievable and implementable? So, so they're, the planning board is asking kind of similar questions. So I think, that's all part of the process. But I do think, for instance, like if we think in the BG, you can go right to the 0 lot line. And because there's not a consistent setback from the property line to the curb line, you can have a building 5 feet from the street or 10 feet from the street. They're recommending, a 2 to 5 foot setback so that during permitting, the regulatory board could say, could this building be 3 feet back? So then we have a consistent sidewalk width. And so, to me, it's like, okay, if the standards say we want 15 feet sidewalks, 15-foot wide sidewalks in the downtown, that's what's comfortable given the building height, then we need a certain, front setback. And so that it kind of all works together. I think it'd be really difficult to somehow do it, with an overlay and something else. But
I'm going to follow up before we hear from the consultants. Just on the sidewalk width and the setbacks, we already allow up to 15 feet from the property line. And in the case of 11 East, our 1 East Pleasant Street, planning board itself did not push back and require that we maintain a consistent sidewalk width. So as typical, if somebody is putting money into development, you're going to max out, if you can, anything that you build. I'm going to go to my question, then I'll let other people talk. So if zoning were to be considered, if we were to consider a zoning change, would the zoning map look a little bit like the colored plan that is shown in these drawings, that we have a whole new district, we have a downtown village or a downtown neighborhood, and with it would be required standards, or is again that up to the desire of, can you link criteria and dimensional standards to a zone specifically? I'll look for answers and then let other people talk.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll answer Pam's question first and then circle back to Mandy's questions that didn't get answered. And I guess this also relates to Mandy's question. So yes, we're recommending changes to the base zoning. We're not recommending an overlay, because we want the purpose of this is to increase consistency of design, right? And so you don't want to create a pathway for people to opt into good design and to be able to opt out of good design. That doesn't really make sense. So we're recommending changes to the base zoning. We're recommending that you create new zoning districts, following the map that we showed. And the purpose of creating those new zoning districts is so that you can have dimensional standards that are specific to those zoning districts. And you can adopt the design standards as standards, regular regulations in your zoning that are required of applicants and not optional. The reason that those building design standards are numerical, predominantly, they're X number of feet, is so that they are objective and they can be included in zoning. And you can review projects based on them, and there's, a legal basis for that. So, did that answer your question, Pam?
Yeah.
Okay. And hopefully it answered your question on your last question, Mandy. So your first question was, is the DRB needed? I think Nate responded to that. I think that's a kind of a bigger question for the town of Amherst than we can answer. I would say that the structure of what we produced would work whether you have a DRB or do not have a DRB, but the volume 1 is particularly useful for a board like the DRB. I recognize both the need for streamlined permitting and reducing the number of meetings and reducing potential conflicts between boards. As you can probably tell, I'm a fan of objective standards. And so we focused on those. But at the same time, there are aspects of design that are not objective, and where having sort of local experts apply their subjectivity and their creativity is really valuable. And so I think it's a question more of like, is it working in Amherst, and is the extra step in permitting overall beneficial, or is it overall getting in the way of progress? So it's like a policy decision for the town to make. And either way, the tools we produced would work for you. The BL to the DN, yeah, there's one parcel north of Alec Street that's changed from BL to DN. And the reason for that is basically just best practice to not have, as much as possible, not have your zoning district transitioning on the edges of properties, but instead have it transitioning on street edges. So that one property was kind of an orphan, and I assume it's an orphan due to the use at the time. So the BL is a business district and the other one is a residential district. So I assume that was why it was an orphan parcel. And I think that answered Mandy's questions.
There was one that said, she said, why are there still single family homes allowed?
Oh yeah,
this
in the
district?
DN. Honestly, never considered whether you should not allow single family homes. I don't have a great answer for that one. There is one existing single family home as far as I know in that district. So I think it's a question of, do you want to make that non-conforming? I think that our general approach is to allow more consistent with the town's goals. So I don't know that you want to force more, but maybe allow more development if somebody feels like it's beneficial to make change.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, I thank you again for the presentation. I don't know how you both do this so many times with this, and I keep smiling. Yeah, in terms of single family home, there is only one, and it's hard to imagine anybody would buy property there and build a single family home. So, see, I have a couple of questions. I don't think I quite understood that there were proposed zoning changes in the RG, which seems beyond the scope. These were downtown design standards, and the RG districts are not downtown. So why would there be proposed zoning changes for the RG? And what are they?
Yeah, so it became clear early on in our conversations we had focus group conversations at the very beginning of the project. And one of the messages we heard from those focus groups, which were with a diversity of people, was that if we did make zoning changes, we were going to be missing a major opportunity because there are fundamental aspects of your zoning that are not sort of in line with a design vision for the downtown and that are preventing change.
Well, what are the RGs though? That's not downtown.
And so as part of that, I think the discussion was, well, where is the boundary of downtown? What is the downtown? So if you define the downtown as the areas in the BL and the RG currently, no, that's not part of downtown. But if you define the downtown as the areas that sort of people told us felt like downtown, then that extends up to the north end of Kendrick Park, which is sort of a key part of the downtown.
So when you talk about the RG, what blocks where changes would have to be very specific to not to the whole RG, which
Yeah,
to
exactly.
like
So
Whitney
it's-
and Taylor Street or
No. Oh, sorry about that. Where'd that map go? So these areas that are shown in green here, which is the west side of Kendrick Park, from McClellan Street to Fearing Street, basically kind of mostly one parcel deep, but in a few cases there's like 2 parcels that are used as one, is proposed to be split off from the RG and rezoned to a new zone called Downtown Neighborhood, which could have most of the standards for the RG now, but a few changes. The triangle between East Pleasant Street and what does that become there? Triangle Street? It's not Triangle Street, it becomes North
It
Pleasant
is Triangle
again.
Street.
So that triangle, and then St. Bridget's Parish Hall, and North Prospect Street from Coles Lane to Amity Street, the green area here, and then a bit of Cottage Street up to Kellogg Avenue.
so I know
Those
we
areas are
talked.
all proposed to be rezoned to a new zone called Downtown Neighborhood. There are dimensional changes to those and some use changes proposed for those. Yep.
Yeah, so I don't want to get too in the weeds, but because we discussed this at the open
Yeah.
house. So that northern part by Kendrick Park, that you
Yep.
would take some of the RG for the neighborhood village.
Yep.
And
Downtown neighborhood,
to
yep.
not, if you got rid of the curb cuts on North Pleasant on the west side of Kendrick Park, and the entrance to the garages or parking lots for those were from McClellan Street. You know, McClellan Street is about the size of a lot of people's driveways in width, and it's right now a 2-way street with parking on one side. It's also the driving school. It's a state permitted, there's a driving school that uses that street. You cannot drive down that street. So between the cars parked on one side, and there's tons of infill on McClellan. So there are like 8 cars in the driveway, and you can park there with the downtown parking sticker. There's bumper to bumper parking on one side and 2-way traffic. And if you're going one way and a car's coming the other, there's no place to pull over. So you literally have to go into a driveway. So if that became the point of entrance and egress for the densification of, the west side of Kendrick Park, that street just couldn't handle it. So anyway, I know that might be later on, but
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, again, the drawings that were shown were meant to explore sort of design intent on a broad scale. They're not required, and they wouldn't certainly override what you do with any development proposal, which is the traffic studies and the impact analysis and so on. So if that was an unsafe place to have a driveway, you wouldn't do it.
yeah.
But the idea was to illustrate a principle of, let's try to connect these rear parking lots, rear parking areas without so many curb cuts along the street. Obviously, it would have to be done safely and so on. And in terms of the changing those blocks to zoning, again, it's sort of following the vision, right? And everything that we heard from people participating in the process is that these areas are different than the surrounding residential blocks. They're kind of a transition from the RG to the rest of the downtown. So it really seemed to make sense to give them their own district that would, provide some mitigation, again, to maintain that transition, but to allow a little bit more growth, but do it in a way that is respectful of the surrounding neighborhoods and really make a balance there that would, take advantage of that wonderful location right next to the downtown, right next to Kendrick Park, and encourage people to build wonderful new buildings, but then to mitigate that with any, negative impacts.
Okay. Thank you.
Andy.
Yeah, I guess I'm just impressed with that you're not trying to do one size fits all on the downtown, and I like the four different districts. I like that there's sort of a respect for the the funkiness of the downtown and the variety that we have, and at the same time trying to have a little more coherence and a little more density as our master plan calls for. So so my understanding then also is that, and I think it's been addressed already, is that these would be new zoning categories for the downtown area, and that, so we're not we're not changing
Right.
something for other parts of town. So it's just you're renaming the downtown zone so they have their own zones.
Yep.
So that's great. You talked about design review boards, and we a little bit about whether we need them or how, if you're entering design standards, the zoning, do you need the design review boards? Do you have any examples of other places that have done this kind of zoning, and do they retain their design review boards, or do they get rid of them, or is it sort of all over the map?
It's a little bit all over the map. So Northampton, when we did their zoning for their downtown, they had an existing downtown design review board, essentially, that actually had the power to issue permits. So it was a little bit more empowered than yours is, where it's just advice. And as part of the rezoning, their purview was scaled back. The area that they regulate was scaled back to basically the historic core of the downtown. So it had grown over time. And so when we added more objective standards to cover other parts of the downtown, their regulated area was shrunk down to the historic core. But they were kept. Other places, either most places don't have a design review board to begin with, and so they don't add one. There are examples in communities outside of Massachusetts. I'm not aware of any in Massachusetts that have what they call a town architect. Basically, is a paid position that's there to review projects and make sure they're in alignment with. It's more of a place that has a real robust form-based code and a lot of new development. And then there's another approach, which I don't know how much you guys do, which is using outside peer review experts for design review. So we do some of that for other communities where they adopt new zoning and then they hire a peer reviewer when there's a project, and the applicant has to pay the peer reviewer to review compliance with your standards.
Interesting. And I guess I just had one other, just sort of, I don't know if it's wondering, but when I look at the drawings and the sort of mock-ups of how various things could look, it's always summer and there's always outdoor dining, and how do you accommodate, how do the standards accommodate New England winters, and does that make a difference in your design?
You want to answer that, Peter? Yeah, so winter is a real thing. It happens 9 months out of the year or something. Yeah,
Feels like it.
Yeah.
if we showed renderings in the winter, it would be a lot less appealing. So whether you have wide sidewalks because you're providing great places for people to sit, or you have wide sidewalks because you're providing space for snow storage, it's still a good idea to have a wide sidewalk. I think that one caution, I guess, I would have is not requiring too much extra public space, because in the winter, those extra public spaces can become dead spaces. So that's one reason for our approach of sort of establishing a maximum front setback. So I think there's often a tendency in towns like Amherst to maybe want a lot of public space in front of every building, but if you have too much, it gets to be too much. So snow storage, you can still sit outside even in the winter. there was a lot of really interesting work done around that in the COVID period, looking at examples of places like Montreal that has like a lively outdoors scene in the winter, and other places in Europe where, you know, providing outdoor heaters, providing wind sheltered areas, and doing programming in the winter can make a big difference. So having, for example, like the ice sculpture festival that they have in Northampton, to bring people out to look at something. So I don't think a downtown has to be a dead space in the winter. And I think what we have probably works regardless of the season.
Anything else, Sandy? Okay, I'm going to follow up just with some consideration of what we would be needing to consider, needing to ponder. And I think one of the items that struck me are the dimensional recommendations that you're making. In particular, as you show your sort of heavy dark lines around the transitions from these downtown districts to the surrounding neighbors, I think it would be really, really helpful if there were some simple graphics to illustrate the buildability of property up against the adjoining neighbors. And I'm thinking, I looked at the Triangle Street, the drawings that you did are really, really great. They really help illustrate what could happen. However, when you look at the dimensional standards that are being recommended, the outcome could be very, very different. And your illustrations are, you know, with the great landscape architecture eye and what would be an appealing place. If somebody is spending money to develop, they're going to probably maximize what they can build. So when you have rear setbacks of, 15 feet next to a 50-foot building, I think that's incredibly inappropriate because right over that property line is a house. Somebody lives there. When we thought about proximity to taller buildings in our University Drive overlay, the consideration for an existing housing cluster was such that we suggested that no building face be any closer than 30 feet from the property line. And your recommendations are 15 feet plus 2 for every story. So you're talking 20 feet maybe. We're saying, let's have a minimum of 30 feet to a building face. And secondly, 150 feet from the nearest building, the nearest home would be 3 stories max. That gives a degree of separation that the dimensional standards that you're recommending do not give. And I'd like to see that concept considered and perhaps given some more weight in just that proximity. I'll just stop there, let Mandy go.
I was actually going to comment on, you'll notice Pam and I have very different thoughts on these matters. My comment before she spoke was actually wondering why on McClellan Street between Halleck and McClellan, there's only, it looks like essentially 2 properties in the downtown neighborhood. Why wouldn't you go farther out to sort of match the property line of the downtown village that's south of Halleck? So why wouldn't you sort of expand the downtown neighborhood a couple more properties west? Sort of, so it's more of a straightish line. And I actually wondered at one point, is downtown neighborhood necessary? Or could we move much of that to downtown village? As a consideration of this is our commercial corridor. It is already really tiny. If we want vibrancy and activeness, shouldn't we be considering expanding it slightly more? It sort of builds on my question of why were we pulling out that one unit, one parcel from the sort of BL and downzoning it almost to downtown neighborhood. Why wouldn't we expand all of the Kendrick Park west side of Kendrick Park to downtown Village, or something like that? I'm not as concerned about the setbacks. I actually on University Drive didn't like the 150-foot thing because when you, and especially here, at least there, when I did the measurements, it didn't take away most of a property. But here, I don't have my GIS out, but if you required 150 foot to the wall of a 3-story building from a property on, say, the North Prospect properties, you might cut out half of the downtown Village district from having any building on it at all. And my understanding is that's not what we're going for. Change is necessary sometimes, but I think we have to also think about, people like to bring up history. What was this use back then? It was for that time frame, what was considered dense housing for workers. How do we reproduce that more dense housing at a price point that the blue collar workers can actually live in? And if we restrict too much, we can't respect and honor that history of our town, which is the ability of blue collar workers, the laundresses of the 100 years ago, the mechanics of today, the facility workers at our colleges to live in our town in a way that is that. So I would actually go the opposite direction and say, how do we expand the downtown Village side or even the downtown neighborhood side to include a little bit more?
Jennifer.
So not surprising. I'm going to respond to that. Yeah, I think we absolutely have to maintain a transition between the downtown. We should have the downtown neighborhood, and it shouldn't it should minimally eat into the RG. So we talk about how we're challenged. I mean, yes, we want a vibrant downtown, of course we do, but we're also saying that we can't fill the commercial space that we have and that we're allowing to be built. So, and it is with 9,000 students that the housing production plan consultants say live outside of Amherst, that would probably like to live in Amherst. It is it will be a long time before this building is at a price point for workers. So it's, we have to assume for the foreseeable future, it's going to be housing priced for students. The RG district that borders that downtown neighborhood, I mean, that's where, music teachers live. These are my neighbors. People that, have, Pilates studios, because, in their ADU. I mean, the concern about pushing out the BG and having these tall buildings, right up to people's backyard, which is what you're going to have. I mean, I'm not even necessarily objecting to it. Beston Street is like worker housing. It's small houses, and the people that live on that street really are, they're high school teachers, they're the workers in our town. And so now you are going to have student housing that's going to be on the west side of Kendrick Park, that's going to be going right up to the end of their driveway, to their backyards. That's what when you look at the west side of Kendrick Park and expanding the downtown neighborhood, that's where it's going up to, is the backyards of the small, modest houses on Beston Street. So again, I would be very mindful that in the RG districts is where you have a lot of people living in small houses on small lots, the people that we want to continue working here. And I actually made a list because somebody made a statement recently that it's the students living downtown that are the lifeblood of our businesses, but there are, 10 businesses that are really only patronized by the year-round residents. Xana's is not a place where they're not even catering to students. It's not a place where 20-year-olds, it's just not the fat. I shop there all the time, but I could list businesses here by Harlow, the Toy Box, past Pine and Astor, Xana's, the list goes on. And they're frequented first and foremost by all the people living in the neighborhoods, which are pretty much RG that surround downtown. So I'd want to be really mindful of not pushing out the residents of the modest houses that are now adjacent to downtown.
Thank you. Nate, and then I think we're close to wrapping up as we transition to not to neighborhoods, but to clean energy bylaws. So Nate, do you want to wrap us up here?
Maybe. I think
maybe talk a little bit about next steps.
Yeah, the planning board had similar questions, and so yesterday we tried to talk through it, and I said, what we'll do is staff will generate a kind of a summary memo from the planning board that they have the same questions. They were thinking maybe only 3 zones, make the green area actually further north along North Pleasant, and whatever, right? They have these ideas, and so I'm not going to say we're not going to have Dodson redraw the downtown and come up with all these new zones, right? So we're not going to have them do that. So I think that becomes a local decision after this process as part of the adoption and implementation. So if, the planning board really wants to expand it and Mandy and others do, so, maybe the CRC has a summary memo that has some of these higher level policy discussions, right? About where does it really apply? What happens to the design review board? And, actually, how does this get implemented? Is it wholesale or is it in phases? And then I encourage the planning board members, if you have individual comments or as a board, specific to what has been proposed, that can also be a separate memo or in the same memo. So, right, again, kind of like those setbacks or some pieces like the snow storage. I thought, there's some good questions there. But we're not going to have, I'll just say it, we're not going to have Dodson go back and say, oh, we're going to reconfigure boundaries at this point. I think that becomes a local decision after the fact. Where do we want to have those changes happen? And so it could be that everyone likes, say, the 3 of the 4 zones, and maybe we move forward with adopting those at one point and we table the other one for a time being. But that's a decision the town can make after. I just don't want to put that on Dodson to kind of come up with a whole new plan in downtown design standards. I will say staff gave them a big area, and I don't think we should be limited by our current zoning. So what the planning board said is, if we like what we have, great, but if we actually want change, then we shouldn't be beholden to the limited BG and have it one property off North Pleasant Street. We're not actually advancing anything if all we have are the design standards apply to us BG right now. And I really agree, right? So to Andy's point, I'm actually hoping that some of these standards, say in the downtown village, if we like them, apply them to the BVC so they're in effect in North Amherst, East Amherst, Pomeroy, and Atkins, right? Or whatever. Like if, I think this can be a tool that we can use and adapt elsewhere in town, although it is specific to the downtown. And I think they've done a really nice job in terms of their existing conditions analysis and actually having those different categories and different visions for each of those zones. Maybe they apply elsewhere, but I think for now, I'm not going to have them say, let's go down to 3 and come up with a whole new third category. But I think a cover memo from the CRC will be important. So the planning board is kind of asking those questions too. And then like, okay, what happens next? Like, what is the adoption process? And, right now, all I've said is let's get our comments in. Staff's keeping track of all the comments, bigger picture policy comments. And I think those will be cover memos that'll be given to Dodson. And I think it can be given to town council and, cross-reference, planning board gives it to CRC and vice versa. And then it becomes a community conversation. Okay, how do we move forward with adoption? And I think that's, will be a really important piece. And, Peter and Dylan have asked those questions and we haven't had, we don't have the answers. There's probably a number of different ways it could be adopted. And so I kind of want to see how, what happens in the next few months. How, what do the boards and committees say? What does the public say? How comfortable are we with some of these pieces? Is it all of it? Is it some of it? And so, I don't think it's too early to tell, but I think, I like where the comments are going. I would say just keep, read through them. If you have comments or questions, you can fill out the forms. You can email staff if you don't understand something, and we can relay that back to the consultant. So if there's something that just, technically you need some help with, we're here to provide that assistance as well. So thanks.
I'm just going to say, I'm not sure, maybe the consultants can answer this. if there isn't real consensus, and I understand the working group didn't have real consensus on some of these elements as well, it'll be interesting, you know, what do we expect Dodson and Flinker to do with our comments if in fact it's not going to be incorporated into changes in the text? What's the point of commenting?
I'll just jump in quickly and then, sorry, Peter and Dylan, if you want to speak.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's still important to get all the comments, but for instance, like the change of the zone right now, that's something we can decide what to do with as part of the adoption. And so if there's really something like, wow, you know, we really, you know, something about, say, some of the design features of the right of way or the architectural standards or the setbacks, I think those are things to consider. But if we're asking them to come up with a whole new set of design standards for a part of downtown, you know, they've already kind of done that, right? And I think what they've come up with is reasonable design solutions, as Peter said at one point. And so what I think is really important to mention is that the working group actually had consensus and agreed on the vision, right? They agreed on a lot of things. It's then the details that become kind of tricky. And so they agreed on the design intent of all those 4 districts. They agreed on the vision. So, you know, the making it accessible and comfortable and resilient. They agreed on all of that, right? They agreed on even the 4 different places. And then where they differ is kind of on those details on how to get there. Is it 3 stories? Is it 2? Is it 3 under a roof? What is the setback? And so I think it's really important to reiterate is that they agreed with the existing conditions. They agreed with the 4 zones and the design intent of each of those 4 zones. So if you like the downtown village and the, you know, and design intent is this, everyone in the working group agreed on that. It's then kind of the details that they differ on. And so that's why I'm kind of pushing back and saying, well, let's have them redesign this whole area. I think they've done a really great job at that. And so I still want to have all those comments come in because maybe there are tweaks that can be made. And maybe, you know, district boundaries do change a little bit, but not wholesale at this point, right? Not like we're going to wipe out all of downtown village. Right. That's something that we can do afterward if we really want to, if the town really wants to do that.
I mean,
But
that was a planning board recommendation, is to consolidate, which I disagree with, but Mandy.
Right.
I think Nate just asked the question. So if we had ideas or answered my questions, but I just want to confirm, if we had ideas of a different boundary for, say, downtown neighborhood or for downtown village, even if it expands it out or not, it's worth putting that in the comments, but that's not necessarily something that would be presented. I'm getting exactly what Nate said, presented by Dodson and Flinker as their downtown design standards portfolio, but we could then bring that back into the conversation when we go to do that. So it's still worth mentioning that ideas when we make our comments.
Yes,
Okay.
very much so. So even like what you said, Manny, that one property, and maybe that one property changes, or maybe they already answered it, you know, to keep it, you know, have a formula or have a consistent setbacks. That's why that one property didn't change. But to be like, oh, I think we should, you know, make a whole new block be something else. That's, you know, I still put it in, but I'm going to say like, we're not going to ask Dodson then to redesign everything and measure the setbacks in those areas because they've already done that and come up with, you know, they've already provided what they think is reasonable, what they think is actually a good, you know, design standard. So, yeah, you know, and that's all.
So I should say we're happy to keep working. For small adjustment to our contract. We've been having a lot of fun. You're great people to work with, and we gladly continue for the next 5 years. I wanted to I know you're short on time, but I wanted to quickly comment because that block west of Kendrick Park is kind of the one area where the consensus was difficult. But I wanted to point out, you know, to Jennifer's points that that Tan Brook runs through there and basically creates a natural boundary between the more purely residential districts to the west and that block. And that's going to create what's going to create a permanent natural buffer to that street. You mentioned, Jennifer, that the people on, what's that street called?
Beston?
Beston. Behind Beston, their backyards are backing up on that.
Right. That's why I wasn't pushing back, you know.
Yeah. So I think that we were conscious that creates kind of a nice permanent barrier between any change along Kendrick Park and the interior neighborhood. So I just wanted to keep that in mind.
Yeah. I mean, there'll be concerns about as you build that close to Tambrook, it impervious, but that will be
right.
That'll be the conservation
commission
or the planning board will deal with that.
Yeah.
I want to go, if you guys will allow us to continue to talk to you. I want to go back to Manny's question about like what kind of comments, are useful. So I'm going to share the actual comment sheet. So this is what's available for downtown. So, we are looking for like the volume, the page, what it says now in your suggested revisions. And then really importantly, the rationale of, why this is a good idea. And on the suggested revisions, it says here, try to think of ideas that would be acceptable to people in Amherst with a different viewpoint than you and as decision makers. So, the goal here is to understand not just what the change is that you're suggesting, but why. So, Pam was talking about, we need a bigger setback because I'm concerned about, overshadowing on neighbors. Like, that's really important. But then also like coming up with decisions that are going to work so that for people with different viewpoints, because we've seen a lot of times in Amherst that people have diverse viewpoints. You're wrestling with real challenges in your community related to, housing and the role of students in your housing market and the value of new development versus historic preservation, and what this downtown should be. They're real weighty policy discussions. So I think that trying to figure out a balanced approach for the future that enables Amherst to move forward is really important, and not getting caught in we can't all agree, so we shouldn't move forward. So I also want to respond to Pam's question of who decides. You had said like, if there's different viewpoints and there's no consensus, then who decides? So I think that's an important question for your town council. Ultimately,
I don't think that was actually my question, but
okay, what was your question?
well, the point was that you might get Mandy Jo's comment and you might get Pam's comment, and they would be diametrically opposed, which is not unlikely.
Right. Yeah.
And so, in that mix, how do you say, okay, so who do we pick if we're going to make any adjustments and tweaks here? I understand that ultimately this would have to come to the CRC, it will have to come to the planning board, it will have to come to the town council for adoption of any sort of thing. I think in response to the reactions to some of the dimensions, some of the setbacks, all of that is very strongly based on where someone might live in town. If someone lives in town where there will be no additional future development, it's a very different reaction to say, it's okay to build up to that neighbor's property line. Who cares? We don't really care that neighbor could turn from a single family home into another student rental because it becomes so onerous to live next to a 4 or 5 story building. I'm sorry, that's not the impact we want any of this zoning change to have on existing stable neighborhoods. That's my guiding principle, is what impact will there be on an existing neighborhood that is, in my mind, critical to keeping anybody in town who cares about the town. Andy, sorry to rant. You're muted.
Yeah. I mean, we have a particular geography and supply and demand situation here with the university sitting right near our downtown. And when you look at those, all those nice buildings that could go up in these different sections, who do you envision living there? And does that matter?
Is that a question for us?
Jennifer, I'll let you answer.
I'm just going to say it does matter.
Well,
Which is
I'm
to say
curious.
we don't want students, but it does matter if what is going up adjacent to your backyard. And again, we talk about worker housing. Many of these are bordering very, modest housing that, people can still afford to buy. If what goes up to your property line is, is our families or, retired. We have a large, senior citizen population in town versus if it's all students, that makes a big difference.
All right,
I
but
mean,
this is just to expand on it. This is a downtown in a college town, and I don't know how much Dodson and Flinker have dealt with other communities like that. But when we talk about places to live in Amherst, there's the whole town, and so what does redesigning the downtown for greater density and greater revenue and greater vitality look like in a college town?
yeah, but we
Should
still
we
have to be mindful.
Of course, but I mean, change is going to change things, and so it's a matter of what are what are on balance positive changes for the town, and how much do we give veto power to existing circumstances? And I'm just curious if the consultants have any thoughts about how this stuff plays out in a small town with a large university right next to it, and anything that we should that any thoughts they have on that.
I'm gonna before they answer, I'm gonna go to Counselor Walker, who has not spoken before, and give her a chance to speak.
Thank you, Pam. I just wanted to say very briefly, thank you to Dodson and Flinker for the presentation. I have not seen it before. This was my first time. And as a new CRC member, I just did a lot of listening and taking notes because I just don't have any prior knowledge about this. So it's really helpful. But just in response to sort of the conversation happening between Andy and Jennifer, I do think it's an important consideration to think about what that would look like and what that would mean for not only the town overall, but also our downtown businesses, and what that kind of turnover means in terms of like long-term residents versus student housing turnover, and what that means for building new housing and increasing density. Because I know that we do have a shortage of housing for all folks, town residents, students, but it looks different when students move into a place and they're here for 4 years or 1 semester or 1 year, and a family who is planning to stay here, or an individual who works in the area and is planning to stay here long term. So I think it's important to think about those impacts on our neighborhoods, but also on our downtown and our businesses. So yes, I just wanted to say thank you, and I unfortunately have to leave early, so I did also want to announce that, but I look forward to being in more conversation about this with you all at our next meeting.
Thank you. And thanks for letting us know you needed to leave. Jennifer and then Nate.
Yeah, I just want to say it is extremely important that non-student residents live within walking distance to downtown. We talk about not wanting suburban sprawl. We talk about people being able to drive instead of walk, people soliciting downtown businesses. The neighborhoods that are closest to downtown, I walk into downtown several times a day. I spend money downtown every day, as do all my neighbors. It is very important that we have a core of long-term residents that can walk and live near downtown and live on smaller lots. We have all that now. But to say, you chose to live in walking distance to downtown near the university, so, that's kind of is very concerning, because I really feel, I know I'm looking out for my district, but I think it's important for the town again. And a lot of the houses surrounding downtown are, modest houses that people can still afford to live in. But even if it won't impact where people who live in outlying areas live. But I think there are lots of students that live in downtown and that live in the RG districts, and there will continue to be, which is great, but we need to be mindful that there is a tipping point, and there's other college towns which no longer have any non-students living near the university or downtown, and I think that would be a real loss for businesses in Amherst and for Amherst. And in terms of, we want to be ecologically responsible, we should be encouraging and welcoming more year-round residents, non-student households, whatever you want to call them, to live within walking distance to downtown.
I don't want to be, I wasn't putting any value judgment on it. I was just asking a question from the point of view of, experts who have dealt with a number of other towns and thinking about the dynamics of the downtown. What is likely to happen if we build a bunch of new housing downtown? Is it likely to be taken over by students, or is it likely to be a mix, or is there ways of designing it so that it's more attractive to families or young professionals? Or the fear I hear is that it's just going to be a frat row or a dorm center downtown, and I don't actually know. So I'm curious if that's been discussed at all by the committee, and if you guys have any thoughts about it, and if not, that's fine too.
I'm going to let Nate, and then we're going to not do solar bylaw today. We are going to go to the rest of our business so people can leave it too. But this is a really good conversation. I would love to talk about it all afternoon, but I'll keep my mouth shut. Nate.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we asked Dodson and Flinker to look at the design standards and really the appearance of buildings in the right of way and not the uses. And they did that a little bit in terms of uses, but we didn't ask them to do a study in terms of occupancy or how to have interior design to change something. And so, we just had a housing production plan. I think, there are ways that if we were going to move this forward, staff and the planning board and its subcommittee, and, you can look at, the CRC can look at other things. We've talked about I've talked with the planning board and the housing trust with having up to 120% AMI in our inclusionary zoning. Having different, standards for regulating students or non-students in the zoning. So staff's looking at that. The housing subcommittees talked and asked questions about that. And so, we're also doing things in other parts of town to encourage certain housing, right? So we have the University Drive overlay. And so it's not, I think there's many different things happening to try to address the housing in Amherst. And so, this right here is really it becomes zoning. It was really about design standards and nice right-of-way standards. Inevitably, it's like, who is the user of that? But I think we're doing other things. The Amherst Planning Board is studying at East Amherst for densification. Whether it's from Hamshall Lumber down to Stanley Street, somewhere in there along College Street and Belchertown Road. And so I think there are many factors and many things happening to address the housing in town for all different users, whether it's students, families, singles, professionals, whatever, retirees. I think we didn't ask Dodson to look at this. So Ithaca does it one way, right? They have their own regulations. State College does it differently. Whatever. Southern universities do it differently. Out in Colorado, UC Boulder does it differently. And so we didn't ask them to do this kind of housing study. And I think those are, again, things that as we move into implementation, we can be thinking about, is there a corollary zoning change to inclusionary zoning that could maybe benefit in this area that maybe applies just to this area or something, right? For instance. And so I think it's a really important conversation. I think, planning board had similar conversations. I just, I think, again, I would, like I told the planning board, we can note this in a memo. And, I don't know, I've been thinking out loud, in my head, and as I hear these comments, is there a compendium to the downtown design standards that, catalogs these comments? And so it's there as part of the report. And then it's, so if someone's looking at it, they can see all these comments from the CRC and planning board and the public, whether or not they're, amended as part of the downtown design standards. And then it's, again, part of a local decision-making process afterward. Because I think there are important questions, but I don't, we're not asking Dodson to spend another year figuring out how to design those buildings so that, who the end user is.
Thank you. I think we can let you all go. Really appreciate your time. And thank you for your widespread effort to discuss and to display and to hear feedback. I think you've done yeoman's work in reaching the boards and committees that really have any kind of interest in this. So thanks.
You still say you'd work with us again.
Oh, we'd love to. Well, I think you should take some credit too, because the only reason this happened is because you were willing to pay for 2 years of meetings and discussion, which a lot of towns are not. A lot of towns get grants to do the design, but not enough public process, and so the thing just falls flat. So I think you've really you've done well here to have to foster this discussion, which wouldn't be possible, of course, without your paying for our hours to have all those meetings. So thank you, and good job.
And kudos to the planning staff as well. I mean, the planning department has been very proactive and helped foster all of this. So we appreciate that as well. Thank you all. We're going to wrap up our business
Okay.
here and appreciate your time.
Thank you. See ya.
See you again soon.
We have meeting minutes from April 2. Did anyone have any corrections or adjustments to those meeting minutes? They were helpful to me since I missed the meeting. I didn't see anything that I didn't know what to correct, but if not, do I have a motion to accept them?
So moved.
Second? I'll second it. Let's take a vote. Andy,
Yes.
Mandy,
Aye.
Jennifer.
You're muted.
You're muted.
If I wasn't at the meeting, can I approve? I guess I'll say aye. I
Yes,
was.
yeah, we can. And I'll say aye as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to adopt it. Okay, thank you. Next agenda preview. We have one more meeting, the 23rd, during which we really should wrap up our conversation with clean energy. We have comments from one planning board member, and I think I heard from Nate that he was going to summarize comments from the planning board. I will follow up with him on that to make sure. Mandy.
Yeah, thank you. I think if we want to move that forward efficiently, we have to vote next meeting, and whatever we end up with is what goes to hearing. It can include a memo that says, and hey, we're still dealing with this stuff that's likely to change. But I'm not sure we should be afraid to say, I think it's okay to admit to the council, this is near ready, but it needs to be, we need to start the hearing process and just be honest about that, instead of holding it up for a meeting or two to finally get through all the comments from the planning board. You know, they're going to get through them because they're going to do it during hearing. So, but we just move it forward, send whatever we have so the council can get initiated to it and say, we'll try and keep you updated. That's my thoughts on that for next week.
That's reassuring. Andy.
Yeah, last time we talked about Doug had, given a fair number of specific comments, which I thought were pretty useful in terms of scanning them. And I think Stephanie was talking about, I'm not sure if it was, I probably shouldn't attribute it to Stephanie, but there may be a subset of those that are sort of easy, like this is redundant, change this wording here.
Yeah.
Can we get those, can we sort of divide those into those two categories and get those put in, or I don't know how that happens, but I thought there was some fairly useful, fairly mundane changes that could improve things. And then the other ones, there may be a few that we need to talk about.
I was suggesting that I take a stab at just incorporating Doug's, edits, basic edits, into the document as track changes, and then all of those items that actually needed some consideration, any decision-making point could be just included as a note, just like we've had all the notes from, Stephanie's, the staff input, and from Mandy's input, that kind of thing. Mandy suggested that per open meeting law, it would be cleaner if we did it within a meeting itself, but I was trying to preload the material into our version 9 document just so we could go through it faster.
Yeah,
Mandy.
to consider, yeah.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because if we preload the question, I think one of the things I was referencing is if we preload, that means we're sort of saying this, I know he's chair of the planning board, but it wasn't even planning board comments. It was an individual person's comments. And we're saying, oh, we're going to preload those in, but have we preloaded any other individual person's comments into a document before we've even talked about it. I think that was more of my concern, is trying to treat every comment sort of the same way almost, versus treating a board and committee comment differently, right? We preload the planning board comments in because they're a board and committee that actually will vote on whether to recommend a specific document that they've preloaded comments into, in a sense. But versus one person, what if we also receive individual comments from another member of the planning board and they disagree with Doug's? Do we preload both? How do we preload both of them in? Sort of the same conversation we just had regarding downtown design standards.
Right.
How do you choose? So I think the better case is for the committee members to come in knowing which ones, sort of pre-marking their own document from, say, Doug's comments or someone else, and saying good, 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 and here highlighting the ones that they themselves want to talk about and say, this one I've got problems with, or I think we need to talk about this one, because that's what really allows us to go through quicker, is if we all know which ones we can just say, that's good, that's good, that's good, versus we got to talk about this one, more than getting it in the document itself, because just because it's there doesn't mean we're not going to talk about it. So
And it occurred to me that even if it was put in as a, here is a Doug Marshall note, that we still had the opportunity to say yes or no, we don't want it, or we're not going to incorporate it. So I wasn't trying to bias by including it, but I don't know if anyone else has received specific written comment from anyone else that we could even consider incorporating or preloading. So, Andy.
Yeah, I just feel like the Scribner's ones, it's like, oh, maybe it's too hard to figure out what's Scribner's and what's, substantive, but for each of us to go through and do that work rather than looking at it marked up and saying, oh yeah, there's a difference, and I don't know, if it's just like you wrote this word twice, whatever. I mean, I just would love to shorten the time that it takes to go through this, but whatever you think.
I would say, Andy, just highlight the ones you want to talk about, and the other ones are really short for you then. Because I agree.
So that goes to having them in the document where we could go through and just say accepted, or and then just knock them off one by one until we get to the one that Andy says, well, I'd like to talk about a little more, and then it's there. I think I'm gonna go through and do it, and then it will be in our packet. If that helps people actually see the comment in context, that may be helpful.
It's almost like receiving an annotated comment from Doug. It's basically just showing what his comments would do.
Right. Mandy.
Yeah. I mean, I just worry that if in the meantime we get comments from someone else, do we do the same thing for that one too? Versus he provided a nice document. Every single committee member can go down that document and say, yes, 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 no, yes, no, yes, no, already there. So that when we go through it as a committee, it's there. But if, Pam, you're going to do it, many times you actually physically highlight in red and physically do that. And that, it makes it really hard to actually change and accept and all. I would request that it actually be a true track change, because the last one that we were dealing with last time, that I was dealing with, a lot of them weren't actually track changes. They were just colored and done. So, which doesn't save a lot of time for the person that's actually then formatting it instead of just being able to accept.
Yep. So noted. Yes. Yeah.
And then I think you'll also have to be careful, if you are doing it, to not change things back necessarily that we changed because he was working off of a different version than we're staring at now. And I don't know how much of that, because I haven't gone back specifically one to the other to see if some of his comments, I know some of his comments have actually been dealt with because I caught them last time in terms of some of those Scrivener ones.
Yep. That's true.
But some of the other sort of a little more substantive, that might have been dealt with when we went from 8 to 9 too. I don't know.
Right.
That careful.
So you've convinced me that I shouldn't do this work ahead of time. I'm okay with that. If you are willing to do all the work that it takes to insert a note, and it's laborious and tedious during a meeting, I would like to get through this so we can actually discuss the elements that need discussing rather than, spending time watching you edit.
And so the other thing about it is the document can be edited after the meeting very quickly. If this is why I say go through Doug's comments and highlight the ones you want to talk about of maybe not accept, because the committee can very quickly say, okay, we've got 8 pages of Doug's comments. Which ones don't people want to incorporate? And those are the ones we pull out to talk about, and then everything else gets incorporated after the meeting type thing. If everyone's identified the ones they want to talk about, the ones that aren't talked about are assumed to be incorporated, and we'll just do it after the meeting.
Okay.
Does that
Before
make
or
sense?
after, to me, it doesn't make a huge
Well, but you
difference.
can't do it before without knowing who wants to incorporate what. That's the thing.
Yeah.
But once you've talked about it, someone can
It-
go back and do it.
It would be Pam's personal, I would put everything in and then we simply accept or talk accordingly. So anyway, I think I'm still going to do it. I'm going to make it available for people if they want it. And if not, they can ignore it and we can go through it in the meeting as is. It'll be my own exercise in considering his notes. Okay. It is 3:08. Announcements. Next CRC meeting is April 23rd. We know exactly what we're going to be talking about, and that is the clean energy bylaw and the timing. And also one thing, Andy attended the meeting with the discussion about joint meetings for planning board public hearings, planning board, and CRC, and the interest and intent is to have a joint meeting on May 20, which is a planning board night, at their regular time. There were 2 additional joint meeting dates. It is for the other zoning articles that they are bringing forward. Is that correct, Andy?
Yes.
This is May 20th?
May 20. And I think June 17 and July 15, I believe, are the dates. It's right down at the bottom of the of our meeting notes.
June 17th and July 15th. Yep.
So I'm gonna write specifically to the CRC and just say, please hold these evenings available. So many hands. Andy.
Just to note that we got through all of the planning board and ZBA application processes except for the ZBA questions. So we should put that on the next agenda too.
Yeah. And that's not too imminent. So we could put it off to the next meeting after that. But it definitely needs to get done. Thank you. Jennifer, then Mandy.
Yeah, I was just thinking if we want to have the ZBA interviews and the planning board interviews during our regularly scheduled meetings, maybe at the next meeting we could pinpoint when that would be. So Andy, as you get the CAFs in, you can ask people to put them on their calendars sooner than later so that maybe there'll be a better chance that everyone can make our regularly scheduled meetings. So we don't have to schedule a separate time because that gets really hard to do with a lot of people.
Totally support that.
Yeah. So May 28 might be a good one to target as at least the first round. Mandy.
Yeah, a couple of questions regarding joint hearings. Presumably clean energy won't be done in one day. And so are they going to continue being joint until they're done? And if so, are they going to be a month apart, like those dates you gave me, or are they going to be at every planning board meeting until then? Did you talk about that? And what are those dates if they're there? Number one. And if we're doing those, are we also still going to have Thursday 1 to 3 meetings in the middle of all of that? Or are these joint hearings going to take the place of our sort of regular meeting most of the time? Just 2 questions on those logistics.
Andy,
I think the thought was that the planning board in particular would generally continue the hearing to the next meeting, and
to their next meeting.
no, to the May 20th would be the first the clean energy hearing, and then they would continue it to June 17th, and they would have discussion in between, I believe, at their own meetings. So they would be hearing it, but they would keep the hearing open, is my understanding.
I would say I worry that we're not going to make our vote out to GOL deadline if we're only holding the hearings once a month, given that
Right.
I'm not sure clean energy can do it in, you're then looking at mid-July. And we can't close our hearing until they close theirs and actually vote a recommendation. I don't think once a month is good enough for clean energy to get it done in time to get it back to the council.
There is another meeting tomorrow to continue planning the CRC and planning board at 10 o'clock, right, Pam?
Yes, that's right.
So we can get further clarification on that. Unfortunately, I might not be able to make that meeting because I have a memorial service to go to, but
Oh, sorry. That seems to be our conflict.
take turns.
Okay. I'm going to go to Athena, but I will note that in the timeline that I put together, it looked like July 15 planning board was the last date to close the public hearing and vote, and then immediately report to town council and CRC. That would give GOL 2 meetings to review if the CRC then closed a hearing on July 23.
Yeah.
I think their hope was to close on June 17th. They would have 2 meetings, 2 hearing nights for that, but
Yeah. Okay.
I'm curious what Athena was going to say.
She was probably going to say her time frame is up and she needs to go.
No, I was just going to jump in and say that we are having a conversation. I'm speaking with Jeff Bagg about it tomorrow morning, and then we'll meet with the larger group. Pam and Andy, I'm sorry you can't make it, but Doug and Nate and Dave will be there to talk through some of the dates. And I am aware of the deadlines to close hearings and so on. I think the intent when we spoke previously for the joint hearings was to open the hearings together, CRC and planning board, and then do separate deliberations and continue hearings on separate dates. That was my understanding. So that because it sounded like planning board and CRC both wanted to have an opportunity to have those deliberations in separate spaces. But like I said, we'll be talking through that more tomorrow. And if any members have questions about dates or questions about the process and so on, it would be great to send those questions or input into me and Pam and Andy so we can raise those at our meeting tomorrow, and we'll follow up with a recap afterwards.
Thank you.
And that is for 4 o'clock, is that correct? 4
No,
p.m.?
no, it was moved up to 10.
It was moved up to 10 or down to 10?
10 a.m. 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
I thought I saw
Yeah, originally
4 p.m. Well, I have a conflict at 10:30, so I could be there for half an hour. This I didn't see that.
Okay, we'll do the best we can with the time we have, and we'll follow up and keep the lines of communication open. This is, I think it's difficult to get everybody in the room at the same time with everyone's schedules and so on. But I think starting a practice of kind of coordinating between these two bodies is going to be really useful while we have all this zoning changes coming up. So I don't see this as, the one and only conversation to have about this collaboration. And I'm hoping that, this is the start of more ongoing communication between these bodies, and whether we need to, get together in a room or just have more email communication, I think that would be great.
Okay, I will try to move my 10:30 meeting back a little bit. Good to know. I'm really glad I didn't, show up at 4 o'clock and
On a Friday, yeah.
on a Friday, right? Okay, let's not cheat around the bush here. I move we close the meeting.
Second,
Jennifer,
yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Mandy,
Aye.
and Pam is an aye, one absent. I don't think she would oppose. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
This
Dave.
was longer
ran
than
late.
expected. Really appreciate everybody's time.
Sure.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Athena.
Thanks.